It is my great honor and pleasure to introduce our presenter for this evening, Frank Schaeffer, who is a New York Times bestselling author of over a dozen fiction and nonfiction books. He's a religious reform activist and a regular guest commentator on The Readout, which is a show on MSNBC with Joy Reid. And he's also a frequent guest of Rachel Maddow. Frank's latest book, Fall in Love, Have Children, Stay Put, Save the Planet, Be Happy, emphasizes the importance of quality human relationships in a joy-filled life and the science that backs that up. His podcasts and his videos have garnered millions of streams. He has hundreds of thousands of followers on social media platforms. His website is at www.lovechildrenplanet.com. And I first met Frank almost a decade ago at the Wild Goose Festival down in North Carolina. And I was really struck by what he said. He was presenting there and bought his book, the book that he's written many books, but this was the one that he had just written. And the title was Why I Am an Atheist Who Believes in God. I have it right here. I may be messing up the title. Anyhow, changed my life, made a big difference for me. So it's my great pleasure to introduce Frank Schaeffer. Take it away, Frank.
Hey, good evening, everybody. Can you hear me okay? JD, everything?
Yeah, we can hear you, Frank. Sounds great.
All right, just checking. Hi, well, thank you for having me. I really enjoy this. I was what do you call it, a respondent to somebody else's paper the last time I was with you all. Tonight I'm doing my own paper, so why don't I dive in without a preamble and we can cover the questions later. I'll just mention that if you are interested in what I'm saying here and would like to stay in touch with me and what I do, you can subscribe to my Substack commentary just by looking up Schaeffer on Substack and subscribing. And with that said, let me begin this paper. I think I'll just call it Enter Genie. Genie's the name of my wife. By the autumn of 1969, I almost never ate in the communal dining room of my parents' bizarre commune mission cult called L'Abri Fellowship. It was an American mission, but located in Switzerland. I hated the fact that our home had been invaded by countless hippies, poets, hitchhikers, backpackers, college students, dropouts, mental patients, and even a few rock stars. All these people were seeking God, or at least a cool place to crash for the night while backpacking across Europe. My parents called these 1960s groovy interlopers our guests. They welcomed them because they hoped to convert the visitors to their brand of American fundamentalist evangelical Christianity. There were often as many as 30 guests sleeping in our Swiss chalet, a chalet originally built to house a family of 6 or 8. If I got up in the night to go to the kitchen downstairs to grab a snack, I'd be stepping over shaggy, bearded, smelly young men and various young women wearing rumpled jeans and tie-dyed t-shirts spread out on sleeping bags all over the hall floor. They were filling our home with the intimate, musty flesh smell of warm breath and bodies that mingled with the faint scent of pine-paneled chalet walls, patchouli oil, and pot. By the time I was in my late teens, I'd isolated myself as much as possible from these invaders. Other than chasing after a succession of the prettiest female guests, I was keeping to myself. I'd been raised in this mission, located in Switzerland of all places, without ever being asked if I liked this way of life. My parents had volunteered our entire family into their ministry. By this time, I'd had enough. I'd grabbed food from the communal kitchen and head for my basement studio where I painted, slept, and edited my Super 8 experimental movies. I was no longer willing to sit through yet more religious and philosophical discussions, what my parents called the long dinner table harangues my pastor guru father indulged in when answering his guests' questions. But that night, I was eating in the dining room for the first time in several months. I don't remember why. When I heard the front door open and poked my head out of the dining room door, into my parents' mission shimmered Regina Ann Walsh. Jeannie was 18. She was tall and so gracefully poised, standing under our old Venetian wrought iron and glass lantern, that I quite literally stopped breathing. High cheekbones, full lips, and almond-shaped eyes slightly slanted at the corner, she appeared to me as an apparition of unattainable perfection. Jeannie's eyes were sparkling and framed by her long auburn hair falling to her waist, points of pelvic bone defined her hips and belly through tight second skin slacks. She wore high glossy boots up to her knees, and her gorgeous face defined a moment that, for me, remains frozen in time and sacred to this day. No Greek goddess ever made a greater impression on a mere mortal. I was stunned. With shaking hands, I hastily set an extra place at the table. After Genie and I talked for a few minutes, she mentioned that she'd heard that the Beatles' new album, Abbey Road, had just been released. Have you listened to it yet? She asked. I have the album downstairs, I said. I'd love to hear it, said Genie. My heart felt like it was exploding. That was 54 years ago. Within 6 of 7 months of visiting, I'd gotten Genie pregnant. We married with all the odds against us, but we had 2 things going for us. Genie is fabulously resilient and kind, and we were in a community that was supportive. I consider myself fortunate to have loved and lived, married and become a parent, fought, been forgiven, started over, loved again, before the advent of porn became de facto sex education for children, and social media undermined actual social connection. Fast forward to 2 years ago, almost to the day. As Genie was being wheeled back to her room in the cardiac unit of Beverly Hospital in Beverly, Massachusetts, after the surgeon had inserted a stent the day after she had a heart attack, I asked her if she'd been frightened. Yes, I was scared, she said. Then, just before I went to sleep, I was overwhelmed with a feeling of gratitude for what a wonderful life we've had. I went to sleep feeling so grateful. To a stranger, Genie's words would have seemed beautiful, perhaps even a spiritual response to the imminent threat of death. To me, there was a poignant, unspoken subtext. I forgive you. Only I knew how horrible I'd once been to live with in the earlier seasons of our marriage. Only I knew how tirelessly Genie worked to be kind and patient, yet tough as nails, in order to cajole, beg, and finally force me to seek help and address my demons. Only because of Genie did I get the counseling and therapy I'll be describing in a new book I'm working on presently. For now, I'll just mention this. Slowly and painfully, I changed and eventually became less of an angry and demanding husband. That said, if my bio used tonight to introduce me here were more complete, this would be added. Frank was taught that men are created by God to rule women, and that women were created to submit to males. He was also taught that animals were created solely for humans' benefit, exploitation, amusement, and pleasure. Bluntly, Frank was groomed to be an asshole by divine right. Enter Esther Perel, a Belgian-American psychotherapist known for her work on human relationships. She might have been explaining how my childhood indoctrination turned me into a shitty young husband when she writes in Mating in Captivity, quote, "The psychology of our desire often lies buried in the details of our childhood, and digging through the early history of our lives uncovers its archaeology. We can trace back to where we learned to love and how. Did we learn to experience pleasure or not, to trust others or not, to receive or be denied?" End quote. After several years of therapy and a memorable stay on Mount Athos with a monastic order of Greek Orthodox monks, I would picture the way Father Basil's example, who had been my go-to monk there, did more to undermine my old ideas about dominating the world of nature and women and children than anything anyone ever said. I glimpsed a working alternative to the cruelty I'd taken for granted as God's will. Father Basil's parting shot was this: what we should judge ourselves on is not how we feel, but how we treat others. Just because you feel unworthy or angry doesn't mean you have to treat Genie as unworthy. It is hard to change your feelings, but Frank, you can change your actions. On my last day on Athos, I was standing next to Father Basil, the old white horse, free to roam and kept in happy retirement by the monks, trotted up to him and nudged his arm. Father Basil produced an apple he'd hidden in his robe. He handed the apple to the horse. Then he turned to me and said, "You owe Genie a truthful confession, more than you owe one to God. In your remaining life, be kinder, even when you are not feeling kind. Sincerity is an overrated virtue. Remember, how you feel is never important. It is how you act that counts. I was rewarded by Genie's most radiant smile anytime a brewing fight suddenly did not happen when I recalled Basil's example. I was often still feeling angry, spiteful, and selfish, but I did begin to change my words and actions. I began to make Genie's joy my project. I'd ask myself a simple question: will this action or these words make her happy? I found that the less I demanded my own way and right to happiness, the harder I worked to make Genie's days lovely, the happier I actually became. Go figure. I found that my joy was greatest by giving Genie joy. Above all, the loneliness of isolating inner anger was becoming a thing of the past. Speaking of isolating anger and loneliness, it is my contention that we are experiencing a loneliness epidemic and a loss of intimacy epidemic, that these epidemics have at least something to do with the emergence of social media in the context of the failure of the sexual revolution to foster joy. I also believe that liberals like me, as I describe my political activism these days, have done ourselves no good by talking too little about marriage, children, and, porn. Maybe we feel that since right-wing evangelicals take so-called family values stands on these issues, we better keep silent, lest, God forbid, someone might momentarily mistake us for conservatives. This reticence to face the hard truth that this has been a bad era for families, pair bonding, and love is changing. For instance, it is the left-wing Guardian newspaper that has led the way in exposing the harm porn is doing to children worldwide. Recently, the New Yorker ran a long piece where the writer found herself saying that it was time to talk about why and how children raised in stable two-parent homes do best. And of course, demographers around the world are noting that country after country is falling below even replacement numbers of children born. So perhaps this is a moment in time I can talk about changes in mores and behavior associated with the sexual revolution that diminished the connection between sex, marriage, and parenthood, perhaps thereby making marriage less ordinary and single-parent childbearing more common and loneliness a thing. According to a study published by the Institute for Family Studies, The Role of Culture in Declining Marriage Rates, March 10, 2016, since the late 1960s, 5 cultural trends have been particularly consequential for pair bonding, sex, and family life. First, the rise of so-called expressive individualism, the idea that personal desires trump all social obligations, means that some Americans feel less obligated to get married and stay married and have come to expect more fulfillment from marriage. In turn, rising expectations for marriage have made Americans more hesitant to marry and maybe less likely to believe that marriage and parenthood are best when experienced together. Second, the changes in mores and behavior associated with sexual revolution diminish the connection between sex, marriage, and parenthood. Third, second-wave feminism, which arose concurrently with women's rising labor force participation in the 1960s and 70s, fostered a sense of independence among women and raised expectations for equality and intimacy in marriage, all of which may have reduced the imperative to get or stay married. Fourth, an increasing number of children were raised in non-intact families. These developments help fuel the fifth trend, what sociologist Andrew Cherlin has called the transition from, quote, cornerstone to, quote, capstone model of marriage, that we will look at in more detail in a moment. What do these trends combine to do when shaping lives, dating, marriage, children, family, and community? Perhaps this is best described, as many people have described it, as a loneliness epidemic. In February 2018, the health insurance corporation Cigna surveyed 20,000 people ages 18 and older. The survey shows that loneliness has become worse in each successive generation. In the introductory overview, the findings of the 60-page study were summed up thus: a loneliness epidemic. When asked how often they feel like no one knows them well, more than half the respondents said they feel that way always or sometimes. Just under half of all those surveyed report sometimes or always feeling alone and or feeling left out. At least 2 in 5 surveyed sometimes say they sometimes or always feel as if they lack companionship, that their relationships are not meaningful, that they are isolated from others, and that they are no longer close to anyone. Approximately 3 in 5 surveyed sometimes or always feel that their interests and ideas are not shared by those around them. A similar proportion surveyed report sometimes or always feeling as if the people around them are not necessarily with them. More than a third of the respondents report feeling as if there is no one they can turn to. Former Surgeon General Vivek Murthy summarized his experience as a doctor dealing with the growing loneliness and alienation experienced by Americans in all social classes. Writing in the Harvard Business Review, Work and Loneliness Epidemic, October 2017, Murthy writes, "During my years caring for patients, the most common pathology I saw was not heart disease or diabetes, it was loneliness." The behavioral scientist Clay Routledge echoes Murphy's findings in Suicides Have Increased. Is This an Existential Crisis? New York Times, June 25, 2018. I am convinced that our nation's suicide crisis is part of a crisis of meaninglessness. A felt lack of meaning in one's life has been linked to alcohol and drug abuse, depression, anxiety, and yes, suicide. How do we find meaning and purpose in our lives? Americans today are waiting longer to marry and have children and are having fewer children. This may be a desirable state of affairs for many people, though evidence suggests that American women are having fewer children than they want. Nonetheless, researchers have found that adults with children are more focused on matters of meaning than are adults who do not have children, and that parents experience a greater sense of meaningfulness when they are engaged in activities that involve taking care of children. Enter the cell phones. Nancy Jo Sales, the author of American Girls, Social Media, and the Secret Lives of Teenagers, writes, quote, "The majority of 11-year-olds own smartphones, and experts are worried." This was in The Guardian, November 2019. "Kids can't seem to put their phones down," she says, which teachers say is disrupting class time and causing innumerable fights and misunderstandings. Sales continues, "Everybody wants to know, what do we do?" End quote. In 1985, the average American had about 3 close confidants, according to the General Social Survey. In 2004, that number hovered just above 2. A quarter of respondents reported having no close confidants at all. 58% of Americans in a Kaiser study saw the increased use of technology as a major reason for feeling isolated. Americans are staying single longer. The median age of a first marriage is 30 for men and 28 for women, up from 23 and 20 in 1960. And then there is the issue of how porn is changing childhood in ways that also lead to dysfunction and isolation later in life, and sexual dysfunction and relationship dysfunction above all. The so-called sexual revolution, in my view, was a bust when measured by quality in human connection, in much the same way as the so-called evolution of social media has led to less actual social interaction and more isolation. In that light, it is a bit ironic to note that today's teens are dating less, if at all, and if surveys are to be believed, having less sex than any generation since the 1940s. That's not to say some silly ideas about sex and love didn't need to be changed by what became the 1960s and 1970s sexual revolution. Virginity until marriage was one of those ideas. Prejudice against sex of the kind my wife Genie experienced from her prudish nuns who ran the Catholic school she was at is another. Prejudice against gay sex. All these biased beliefs needed to go. I am glad they did, but that's a long way from disconnecting sex from love as an ideal and trying to make sex positivity, so-called, isolated from feelings, the new, quote, normal. So where to begin? The groundwork laid for normalizing the loss of intimacy we are experiencing today, and arguably the entire turnoff to sex surveys are identifying in many younger people, can be summed up in the life of one Alfred Kinsey. Kinsey was an entomologist with an experience in gall wasps and also a pedophile with something to prove that his pedophilia was okay. Caleb Kane noted in the New York Times in an article called "The Truth About Kinsey's Sex Life Exists, but it's locked away in the archives of the Kinsey Institute for Research of Sex, Gender, Reproduction at Indiana University," describes the encoded 7,985 sex histories Kinsey collected and another 10,000 or so collected by his team and protected by the Institute's strict policy on confidentiality. Kinsey wrote to Rex King, a fellow, quote, researcher, coaxing him to send details of his diaries of sexual exploits, including those with children. On November 24, 1944, for instance, and this is what was quoted in the Times, Kinsey wrote, quote, "I rejoice at everything you send, for I am then assured that much more of your material is saved for scientific publication." Kinsey published much of King's data in Sexual Behavior in the Human Male, where tables summarize King's attempt to bring orgasm to boys between the ages of 2 months and 15 years, in some cases over a period lasting as long as 24 hours. Kinsey attributed the data not to one source, but to many. The descriptions make for exceptionally difficult reading, yet no one objected to them publicly until 1981, when they came to the attention of an independent researcher named Judith Reisman. Ms. Reisman has devoted much of the last 2 decades to her case against Kinsey. End of quote. That's all from the Times article. Playboy's founder, fawned over by many Hollywood celebrities and glorified in his magazine, trafficked drug girls to his male pals. Hefner said he felt liberated by Kinsey's discoveries. No wonder. These were soulmates. Hefner fashioned himself a champion of freedom of sexuality and freedom of speech in a repressive post-war era. But in an A&E docuseries that's recently been released, Secrets of Playboy, we learn how the Playboy venues became a seedy playground for sexual abuse, rape, and even bestiality. According to one of Hefner's many live-in, quote, girlfriends, Sandra Theodore, quote, Hef demanded group sex 5 nights a week. You couldn't satisfy him. He wanted more and more and more. It was cult-like. The women had been groomed and led to believe they were part of his family, end quote. And Mickey Garcia, former director of Playmate Promotions, said Hefner hosted weekly, quote, pig nights, during which he would bring in, quote, ugly prostitutes, these are in quotes, to have sex with his friends. He also kept a stockpile of quaaludes known at the mansion as leg spreaders and regarded as, quote, necessary evil because they made women, quote, do anything. It was the same script, quote, welcome to the family, we're embracing you. It was all a lie. I watched girl after girl show up, fresh-faced, adorable, their beauty just washed away. We were nothing to him. He was like a vampire. He sucked the life out of those girls for decades, end quote. What was the final act of the sexual revolution? Perhaps it was Jeffrey Epstein's saga of rape and child abuse and the many respectable conservative and liberal leaders in the legal profession stepping up to defend him. Or maybe it was social media-fueled final act described in the New York Times as The Children of Pornhub by Nicholas Kristof, December 2020. He notes, quote, Google returns 920 million videos on search for, quote, young porn. Top hits include video of naked, very young teen engaging in sex acts on X video, along with video on Pornhub, whose title is unprintable here. And in another expose of Google, quote, this is the title, Why Do We Let Corporations Profit from Rape Videos? New York Times, April 16, 2021. Kristof writes, quote, and then he's quoting somebody at the start of the article. I have no problem with consensual adults making porn, says Canadian student. Who cares? The problem is that many people in pornographic videos weren't consenting adults like her. This is all from the article, or rather the article. Just after she turned 14, a man enticed her to engage in sexual play over Skype. He secretly recorded her. A clip along with her full name ended up on X videos, the world's most visited pornography site. Google searches help direct people to this illegal footage of child sexual abuse. Quote, the shame I felt was overwhelming, the Canadian student says. Pierre Woodman, a veteran European pornographer, told me, this is the writer in the article speaking, that Twitter, Facebook, Reddit, and other sites all sprinkled with child sexual abuse imagery. Google is a pillar of this sleazy ecosystem for roughly half the traffic reaching X videos, and XNXX appears to come from Google searches. Quote, the PornTube sites are obsessed with their Google rankings because Google is their lifeline. said Micklethwait, the founder and CEO of Justice Defense Fund, which fights sexual exploitation online. Quote, Google is the primary means by which they drive traffic to their sites. And that's the end of that article. Modern techies had a self-important belief that great engineers can and should guide society. Did they know that they would provide an online highway for profiting from child abuse, guiding men to rape videos? No, nor did they know that their algorithms would ignite ethnic and racial hate worldwide and intensify divisiveness. Now the bill, as it were, for the tech naivete is due. According to The Guardian, France is reckoning with the harms of online porn, but will anything change, by Marie Lecomte, November 9, 2023. It is November 9 today. And as I was putting this paper together, this as in my morning reading, and I'm going to share it with you here. Quote, in short, everyone agrees that the pornography industry and the way people engage with pornography must change. This is from The Guardian, but no one agrees on what ought to be the way forward. It is a frustrating state of affairs. Sisyphus wakes up every morning and pushes the same boulder up the same hill. Anti-pornography campaigners and pornography professionals write reports, letters and columns disagreeing with each other. Nothing gets done, end quote. As reported by The Guardian, most recently, it's France's turn to agonize over so-called adult content, how it's produced, what it leads to, and whether it should be banned. The catalyst was a report launched by the High Council for Equality Between Women and Men, HCE, a French government-nominated watchdog on gender equality. And this report just got launched in France, and it was in the context of that The Guardian was reporting. Across more than 200 pages, the report, Pornocriminalité, makes the case that the pornography industry has been skirting around laws on physical and sexual abuse, promoting harmful behavior and standards, and having the intention, this is in quotes, to make women suffer because they are women, end quote. Many of the numbers in the report are startling. According to their research, 51% of 12 and 13-year-old boys and 31% of girls of the same age watch pornography at least once a month. The median age at which children watched pornography for the first time was 14 years old in 2017, but just 10 years old by 2020. In 2019, Xmaster, one of the most popular pornography sites in France, published a list of its most searched keywords. Rape was 9th, burette, racist slang for a young North African woman living in France, was 1st. The recommendations made in the French government report are stark. All pornography, say the researchers, should be seen in the eyes of the French law as akin to prostitution. Camming, that's in French, or performing on websites should also be seen as a form of sexual exploitation. Pornography websites refusing to enforce strict age checks should get blocked by internet providers like Google, which of course does not block anybody. The phrase travail du sexe, sex work, should be banned from all government and public communications. And that's the French government report. Whatever else the sexual revolution did, it was not to contribute to people pair bonding. More successfully. Far fewer people marry post-sexual revolution than before in our recent history, or if they do marry at all, they are already halfway through their lives. And on the college campuses, those cheerful baskets of condoms placed in dorms a generation back are now bookended by ever-expanding procedures for, quote, handling allegations of sexual assault. Moreover, more and more young people have delayed or given up on forming lasting relationships altogether. Work, career, money are what youth is about these days, not love or even sex. Education, career, money, and prestige top the to-do list, way ahead of anything as profitless as mere love. Perhaps it's the last 50 years of social experiments with people's pair bonding habits and lives that, if today's statistics on loneliness are any guide, can arguably be shown to have failed. On a personal note, maybe Genie and I were lucky we didn't know any better and just followed our hearts and what my parents would at the time have called our, quote, animal desires. Jean-Marie Twinge, or Twang, I can never figure out how to say her last name, is an American psychologist researching generational differences, including work values, sex, and life goals. She is a professor of psychology at San Diego State University and author of iGen, Why Today's Super Connected Kids Are Growing Up Less Rebellious, More Tolerant, Less Happy, and Completely Unprepared for Adulthood, and What That Means for the Rest of Us. That's her title. Twenge, or Twenge, Twenge, using detailed graphs and surveys, says that iGeners, her term for Gen Z, are less likely than their predecessors, let alone old fossils like Genie and me, to even go out on dates or have sex, and are postponing romantic relationships until, quote, much later, if ever. Even college is too early for anything romantic, according to many younger people. Twenge interviewed, I think it's not good to be in a relationship at all during college because you need to focus, explore, make money, study, and spend time with friends. Twenge quotes a student telling her. Another student says, being in a relationship at that age makes you feel like you are smothered, brings drama, and holds you back from your true potential. I saw a lot of talented people in my age group stop going toward their goals, all because of a relationship. You can achieve more by not being in a serious, committed relationship. No relationships, no problems, said another. Whereas previous generations married young and only later found out their economic prospects together, many iGeners have long lists of things they think they need to get in place before getting married or even dating. Talk about Genie and me being out of step. Americans aren't just waiting longer to get married, fewer are getting married at all, with the US marriage rate reaching all-time lows. This is likely to continue for iGen. More iGeners than any other generation were raised by unmarried parents or single mothers. But, Twenge notes, in the last decade, quote, something interesting has happened. The percentage of unmarried young adults living with a partner has stayed about the same, while the percentage of those who are married has plummeted. That means that more young people are truly single, not married, and not living with anyone. The trends, write Twenge, all seem to be going the same way. Fewer young adults are having sex, fewer in committed relationships, and fewer prioritize marriage and family. So if younger people aren't into relationships, what are they into? Asked Twenge. It's not politics. iGeners are actually less likely to take political action. Political participation reached all-time lows in 2014 and 2015. There is just one thing that seems to replace and eclipse everything else previous generations took for granted, including forming sexual pair-bonded relationships. Quote, iGeners are addicted to their phones, and they know it. Many also know it's not entirely a good thing, end quote. If Genie and I had started our romantic pair bonding journey today, our likelihood of finding the joy we have discovered in a long marriage, having children young, fighting and making up, seeking help, and having grandchildren early in our lives would have been remote. Remote is actually the wrong word. It would have been impossible. Do the fertility math. And what about intergenerational connection? What about the truism that it, quote, takes a village to raise a child? By our career-first model, we have effectively removed actively involved grandparents from the family reciprocity, love-motivated childcare picture. This is insane. Is insane too strong a word? No, at least not if staving off loneliness is a worthy goal. Moreover, we seem to have evolved as a species to need grandparenthood biologically. Studies show that grandparents who care for grandchildren live longer. Bluntly, on average, older people who are not doing any childcare die sooner than they would have if they'd been caring for grandkids. Another consequence, which, by the way, we'll look at a study in a moment on that. Another consequence of disconnecting from what might be called a natural fertility clock is that children don't grow up in a multi-generational environment. Old people are seen, if at all, during visits rather than as part of a daily comfortable routine. We Americans are no longer an intergenerational community, but live at a time when, quote, productive lives are seen not in terms of meaning and joy and connection, but strictly in terms of employment cycles. All important shared intergenerational connection, pleasure, and love are sacrificed to career. And there is another thing to consider. Young people need the wisdom of experience in their lives, not to mention the unconditional support of loving grandparents. And grandparents also pay a steep price. According to the Berlin Aging Study, first published in the Journal of Evolution and Human Behavior, older people involved in grandchild care live longer, as I mentioned. Psychologist Ralph Hertwig and his colleagues at the Berlin-based Max Planck Institute for Human Development evaluated data from the study in which more than 500 people aged over 70 were interviewed between 1990 and 1993. Then they were followed until 2009. The researchers found that half the grandparents who looked after their grandchildren were still alive 10 years after their first interview, while half of those who didn't, and also the non-grandparents in the control group, died within an average of 5 years. According to findings in the University College London 2020 study, Living Alone and the Risk of Dementia, a systematic review and meta-analysis, dementia risk leaps by 30% if you live alone in your 50s and 60s. Isolation takes a much greater toll than previously thought. The study surveyed 21,666 people over the age of 55. The authors warned that there are a growing number of elderly people living alone and that loneliness seems to be a bigger factor than physical inactivity, even diabetes, obesity, or high blood pressure in triggering dementia. Now back to the cornerstone versus capstone marriage thing I mentioned before. How marriage underpins social inequality is the subject of The Two-Parent Privilege, Chicago University Press, by Melissa Kearney, a professor of economics at the University of Maryland and a senior fellow at the Brookings Institute. Kearney writes, quote, "Other people and experts are trained and experienced at eliciting the deeply personal stories of others through extensive interviews and powerful vignettes. That is not my particular expertise. Her expertise, her comparative advantage, as she puts it in the language of her trade, is in analyzing large sets of data to produce quantifiable findings about the effects of marriage upon society at large." And why we need to talk about marriage, New Yorker, October 23, 2023, Rebecca Mead reviews Kearney's book and writes, quote, "Kearney begins by setting forth what she acknowledges is a difficult argument to make, at least if one does not want to be accused of being a doctrinal social conservative, that the decline in marriage rates and the corresponding rise in the number of children being raised in one-parent homes has contributed to the economic insecurity of American families and has widened the gap in opportunities and outcomes for children from different backgrounds, and today poses economic and social challenges we cannot afford to ignore, but may not be able to reverse. There has been a dramatic rise in births to unmarried mothers, almost half of all babies born in the US in 2019, up from 18% in 1980. Of course, those unmarried mothers, more than half have never, of those unmarried mothers, more than half have never been married rather than having been married and subsequently divorced. Kearney highlights the racial disparities revealed by the data. 70% of unparented Black mothers have never been married. Unpartnered, not unparented, unpartnered Black mothers have never been married, compared with 38% of unpartnered white mothers. She also points out that perhaps surprising stability of marriage among members of the educated class. Of the children whose mothers are graduates of four-year colleges, 84% lived in homes with married parents. Having two parents who are married to each other, Kearney argues, provides offspring with an advantage that is, quote, becoming yet another privilege associated with more highly resourced groups in society. Kearney insists that she is not blaming single mothers or dismissing the effects of structural racism or saying that everyone should marry or calling for a reinstatement of the model of 1950s household. And by the way, nor am I. And if you read my books that I've written about this, or let alone the one I'm writing now, you'd find that, in this area, I'm not judgmental. That said, with a waged father and a stay-at-home mom, in the old model, children were arguably better off. She does not suggest, like some cultural critics before her, that the increase of out-of-wedlock birth rates is a signal of moral decline in America. Rather, Kearney explores research on the impact of financial strain on cognitive functioning. There's evidence that the children of parents who are poorer and more consumed by stress may be shortchanged not only materially, but emotionally. Kearney offers one interpretation of this data. Quote, relationships are inherently difficult and marriage provides an extra layer of institutional inertia that keeps them in place. Alan Hawkins, a professor of family life at Brigham Young University, and Brad Wilcox, director of the National Marriage Project at the University of Virginia, have written about recent research that suggests that, despite the stereotypes of how, quote, disastrous young marriages like Genie's and mine are, younger couples in communities that support them actually can do very well. They report that these days, in more educated secular circles, marriage is supposed to be a, quote, capstone achievement rather than a cornerstone of young adult life. The only people bucking this trend, they write, are often those within religious marriage-supporting communities. That was the case with Genie and me. And as many people will find out, it is often in the religious communities that most of the babies are being born. Speaking of right-wing, quote, replacement theory, it is the upscale, wait till 40, to have that one child, educated liberal class, may well be replaced, compared to, say, the Orthodox Jews, African Catholics, and Hispanic American Pentecostals. Be that as it may, whatever one thinks of religious communities, and in spite of the fact that I fled my evangelical indoctrination, I'm so glad I did, it is clear to me that younger couples lucky enough to begin their relationship in any, quote, village that supports them, be that religious or secular or familial or all combined, have a far better chance of their relationships succeeding than anyone else. At least that seems to be the case according to the findings of the National Marriage Project. With no religious or other marriage-supporting communities, many couples, according to the project, find themselves alone. There seems to be no help with childcare for many people. This is a recipe for marital, relationship, and child-raising disaster. There's more. Our politically divided culture is not helping pair bonding either. Dating app and website staff report another growing obstacle in making romantic matches: the share of users setting political criteria for hookups or dates. The Survey Center on American Life, a project of the American Enterprise Institute, recently found that about 2/3 of liberal and conservative singles would be more likely to, quote, swipe left and reject a potential match who did not share their politics. The capstone model says that you are supposed to have your education, professional success, and a clear adult, quote, identity before you even consider marriage. So the median age of first marriage has increased over the past 50 years, as we have seen. This trend to older and more calculated marriages as the next, quote, age-appropriate life stage shows no sign of leveling off. It has also made fertility a big issue for many people waiting for the, quote, right person or the right job to come along and the right age to then marry and or have a child. A national survey of millennials ages 18 to 33 found the vast majority of respondents think that marrying later means both people, according to Hawkins and Wilcox, will, quote, be more mature, more likely to have achieved important personal goals, and more likely to have personal finances in order. Moreover, these young adults believe that later marriage will be more stable and of higher quality, end quote. That is the widely accepted millennial and iGen cultural narrative. They may not know it, but this, quote, delay love narrative fits very conveniently with corporate America's capitalist priorities of shareholder profits. It also risks denying potential lovers and parents and grandparents joy. American corporations and universities have become expert at convincing students and younger workers to redirect their energy and passion to more and more higher education and then to careers instead of to relationships, marriage, and children. Only later do many people wake up to the fact that they gave their best years and certainly their most fertile years and passions to very undeserving, quote, lovers. In other words, to businesses and shareholder profits. I'm not the only person lamenting our collective lack of connection. In 5 Lies Our Culture Tells Us, New York Times, April 15, 2019, columnist David Brooks puts what I'm trying to say about the ultimate value of love like this, quote, people looking back on their lives from their deathbeds tell us that happiness is found amid thick and loving relationships. It is found by defeating self-sufficiency for a state of mutual dependence. It is found in giving and receiving of care. In reality, the people who live best tie themselves down. They don't ask, what cool thing can I do next? By planting themselves in one neighborhood, one organization, or one mission, they earn trust. They have the freedom to make a lasting difference. It's the chains we choose that set us free, end quote. Maybe younger marriage can sometimes be a good thing besides resulting in younger grandparents, if that is, the young couple have the support of family and a close-knit community. A true partnership is a thing of beauty. Genie and I have long since apportioned our chains of connection tasks according to what we each do best, and also what we each most hate doing. So these days, I do not even know where the checkbook is. I never meet with financial planners, lawyers, or bankers. Genie has shown our son Francis where everything is in case she dies first. I am happy not to be in charge. Conversely, I do the food shopping. I know where things need to be in the kitchen in order to cook our meals. I know the best sources of homegrown yellow and white peaches, what month the farm stand will have them. I plant what we need in our vegetable garden and build granite walls in the style of the terraced gardens in Italy, so our tomatoes ripen early because of the retained heat in the wall. I have kept working as a writer, earning income after Genie retired from her successful 22-year career as a publisher. In other words, Genie and I care for each other by each doing what we are best at doing for the other. We are not lonely, we are lucky. I am so glad Genie and I married young. Life is short. No matter how long I live, it will not be long enough to be Genie's lover. I bend to kiss her hand again. It is exquisite as ever, but these days, the thinning skin seems vulnerable as a wisp of tissue paper, drifting inexorably toward a flame. In case I die first or slip into mute dementia, someone please tell Genie that if I could choose my last words to her, they would be, thank you.
Wow. I'm glad I don't have to respond. That was a lot. I'm just going to go ahead and introduce our respondent. Thank you very much, Frank. I look forward to the discussion. The Reverend Dr. Barbara Whitaker Johns is a Unitarian Universalist minister who currently serves IRAS as an honorary vice president and as a speaker in various other settings, especially UU parishes and at IRAS-sponsored events. She has served a leadership role in IRAS for over 3 decades, including roles as our president, vice president for summer conferences. She's co-chaired 5 of our annual conferences. She's offered the Morning Chapel Talk series for another 5 conferences. She's been very active. She started out majoring in nursing at Simmons College, but developed an interest in the theology of Paul Tillich. So she began graduate studies at Union Theological Seminary in New York. But life circumstances led her to a 2-decade teaching career with a focus on neurodiversity associated with learning disabilities. But again, under the influence of Paul Tillich's work, she went and earned her Master of Divinity at Harvard, and then entered a long career in full-time UU parish ministry, where she is still serving now on Cape Cod. Along the way, she completed a doctorate of ministry degree with the theologian Matthew Fox, focusing on the power of our personal stories to ground faith development in a scientific worldview. That couldn't be better aligned with IRAS's mission, and also with what Frank just shared, personal stories to ground faith development. So let me introduce, or let me go ahead and bring up Barbara. And Barbara, what are your thoughts on what Frank shared?
Well, I need a few minutes to collect myself after all that. I'm very grateful for your presentation, and also to JD, as I understand, was instrumental in bringing you to do this webinar, Frank. So thank you. And I do have a tendency to over-prepare, but this was really out of my own interest and curiosity that when I knew I was going to be the respondent, I picked 2 of your books that seemed most captivating to me, the one about fall in love and so on, and the one Why I'm an Atheist Who Believes in God. And I have just in the space of a week or so felt very affected by them, in both at a personal level and in thinking about my own work. And I listened to a few of the podcasts, and I think so I'm speaking in general now about your work, in addition to what you just gave us, that I really appreciate your writing and speaking about family relationships and work in the world in the setting of your family and religious background. That means a lot to me. And also I love the way you weave together concepts, facts, and stories. I think stories are really powerful, and your exquisite portrayal of your own lived experience. And then all this in your books, you also add on like a blueprint for how we change the world. So it's a lot, and gratefully received. I have a very tiny question that I hope you won't take time to answer, but if there's time at the end, maybe you could. And that is, I read about your practice of getting up at 3 a.m. to write. And I like to get up at 5 a.m. to do things like that. But then I have to go to bed at 9 or 10. And I used to get up at 3 a.m., but that would put you to bed at an hour that doesn't necessarily work with community or social gathering. So I'm just curious about that, but set that one aside for now. I also think that as a respondent, the questions I might put to you have to do with my generation, and much of what you've talked about are concerns for younger generations. And I am just into that generation that is called the silent generation. You're the boomer generation. So I have witnessed in my own family the concerns about the younger generations that you've written and talked about. They're very real to me. And in fact, I realize that I am guilty, if I can use that word, of even promoting that concept with younger people, including my son, who's we have one adopted son who's a millennial. The idea that, well, get your life together first. And I am really actively rethinking that. So I think that my biggest questions have to do with, because of one of the books of yours I read, wanting to know how your understanding and experience of God now, not when you were young, how that relates to your understanding of love, especially love as it shows up in pair bonding. And even if folks have paired at a young age, putting it before career and education, but then later realized that in some way their bond wasn't for what you might call true love, or love that could sustain a lifetime. How does your understanding of God relate to that? And then how does your understanding of God now relate to people who finally later in life get it right? So I just want to offer a little context for some of these questions that I have. That I grew up in the environment of Bangor Seminary in Maine, and in a very liberal church from the time I was a young kid. And my father was a minister and president of that seminary, was very liberal politically and theologically, unlike in your family. But my home life was very restrictive and did not feel safe to me as a child, but not for reasons of any religious dogma that was forced upon me. And the place that was safe for me was church. And from a young age, church was the message that I internalized, that God is love, the activity. And later, as I grew up and went through my previous careers and so on, I began to develop experiences of God not as a being, but as the activity of love throughout the cosmos. Like some people have said, God is a verb. So I think that when I was young, I trusted something like these words. This is a favorite song of mine by Andrea Bocelli, Fall on Me, which I think is really meant to be addressed to God, but I think is also related to finding true love for your life. It goes, the beginning lines, I thought sooner or later the lights up above will come down in circles and guide me to love. So I think, I mean, that was my view as a teenager of what would happen. And I think the story of you and Genie being supported in your young love it's almost heart-wrenching to me, because I think that adult recognition that two people that young can be guided to love as the activity of God is extremely rare. Not for the same reasons that love is set aside today, but more back in your generation or mine. And yet I get from your story the sense that you and Genie felt, even if you didn't have the words for it, that even as kids, that was what was happening. And so I just want to read a few lines from your book about why I am an atheist, that about your experience of God that really speak to me. These lines, my thought is that existence is, pro or con, the wrong idea of God. Like, that's the wrong question. Does God exist? My relation to God has come to be a pillar of my life. And then these lines, the real question is one's relation to God, the role God plays in one's life, the character of one's spiritual life. And what is fundamental is the experience of God, for example, in prayer or in life's stunning moments. And I may be projecting, I get the feeling that your meeting Genie when you were young was one of those stunning moments that could not be ignored. It might have been in one of your books that you referred to somebody who said they knew true love in high school or in college, but set it aside for all the reasons that you've written about, and later said, I didn't know, I would never find it again. So I also wonder how you feel about folks who from my generation or your generation knew deep love at a very young age, but it was denied or destroyed, not for the reasons that's happening today, but because they were torn apart by family or by society. And then perhaps some of these people later have a hard time trusting that the activity of God as love does bring couples together. And so they go on to marry and bond for reasons that maybe have to do with elements of friendship, or they're rationally wise and good decisions, but perhaps not the stuff that's a foundation for knowing the sacred in each other over a lifetime. So I think, in addition to redirecting young people today to the significance of pair bonding and family, I wonder, how does your concept of God now relate to people who still believe in the sort of love and growing up in love that you and Genie found, when that finding has been negated when it first happens, but then reappears later in life?
Well, thanks for the response. And thank you for reading my work and quoting some back. It's lovely to have you as a as a reader and a friend of my work. So that's lovely. Thank you. There's a couple questions there, and I'll offer a few thoughts. In terms of today, my relationship with God in this present moment, I would say I've come to a place where I no longer look for logic, let alone theology, in that experience. I'll give you an example. I think intellectually, if someone said, how would you define yourself? First of all, I would reject the necessity of having to do that. But if I was forced, I would say, well, when it comes to the certainty of the existence of God, or any kind of theological revelation of God through one of the scriptures, but the Bible, the Quran, or anything else, I'm no longer in that place. But that said, every morning when I wake up, the first thing I do is pray for my children and grandchildren, my family, for their protection. And I do not do this because of belief. I do this because that's how my mother raised me. And then I add somewhat facetiously, do you have a problem with that? In other words, I think we look for these sweeping logical definitions of belief, and it's the same in the area of love. When we look for reasons for things, and I think that one of the great evidences of our lack of humility as human beings is that we don't take stock of the fact that we are a semi-evolved, struggling species that has not even defined what we're doing here in our daily lives, let alone theological presuppositional thinking, and this kind of thing. So that to refer to, well, I do something because that's how my mother raised me, actually makes a lot more sense than often giving reasons for things. And it isn't only in the area of faith. It's the same when we define the word love, not just God's love, but love. I've said sometimes to Genie when we've talked about our relationship that, on some days in the middle of a big fight back in the bad old days, love could have been defined that one or the other of us, while hating the other, and I use the word advisedly, in the midst of real knockdown, drag out bad times, had an impulse to give the other person another chance. And we weren't in love at that moment, and there was nothing loving. It was just, that's what we wanted to do because we valued the relationship even when we hated it. I know that sounds counterintuitive, but in that moment, that's what love was. There are other times when it's something much different and very wonderful. And I think it's the same with where I am right now in my belief in God. I'm furious and saddened by the fact that whether it's in Islam or Christianity or Hindu nationalism, the whole world seems to be marching in step towards various forms of intolerant theocracy. And, no one dares say this in case they're going to be accused of being anti-religious or Islamophobic or, racist, because most Hindus in India are a different color than the white person talking. But the fact of the matter is, we're in a worldwide conflict that far beyond simply Gaza and Israel, where people are discovering again, as they did in the 100 Years' War in Europe, started by Edward III against the King of France, that certainty, and religious certainty above all, kills. So the first thing I've learned to do in life, whether it's being married to Genie or in my view of God, is to begin every thought about this, I could be wrong. And it isn't certainty, it is a hope. Those are two different things. And, that's been the lesson of 54 years with Genie at this point. And that is that when I look back at our worst moments, it always had to do with hardened certainties about my role or her role or what we should be doing or the minimum we needed. So that's one comment. And then when it comes to people getting together later in life, of course, I'm not laying out what happened to Genie and me by luck, because luck is a big thing. When one of the only soccer commentaries or football, as I think of it, having come from Europe, that was honest, was someone saying, well, a third of all goal scorers are just lucky. It's nothing to do with skill. Luck plays a part. And I feel the same. I could have gotten all kinds of early girlfriends in the Labrie community might have fallen pregnant with me. I was just very lucky that it turned out right place at the right time. Same with getting my first novel published. Same with surviving a crash in Canada where my car flipped and I rolled over 3 times down a snow-covered embankment. That I don't take credit for surviving that. I wore my seatbelt, so I guess I was a little prepared, but I was just really lucky. I was fortunate, and you can call that a blessing or not. So the first thing I would do is not hold up some certain sure form of time. The right age to marry, the way to do this is not, Jeannie and I were fortunate, and I was most fortunate in meeting her and not half a dozen other people I might have met that evening, and things would have turned out very differently. I could have been married and divorced 7 times by now, given my temperament. But it turned out that I married someone that actually had such a passion for that I changed for her. I did a lot of work, and she was very patient and forgiving. And when you put those 2 things together, a willingness to change and grow together, combined with someone who's forgiving and someone who eventually seeks some therapy and gets some help, you have a shot. So when it comes to different ages, I know people who have passionate love stories in their 60s and 70s. I know people who married very late and things worked out wonderfully. But I'll tell you something where we don't have enough humility, and that is we all think we think independent of our environment. We don't. Passion, sexual passion, procreation, pair bonding, all the normality of evolution that we get from our primate ancestry. It's talked about so revealingly in one of my favorite books by Elizabeth Thomas Marshall Thomas, where she writes about the hunter-gatherers of the Kalahari that she lived with in the late 1950s for a number of months and then years, that have been in their part of the Kalahari 80,000 years. That's 80,000 years. Was to observe the kind of common human attributes in that hunter-gatherer society that proved to her and to many other people that it never was about the survival of the fittest and a kind of a fist-in-your-face barbarism, but the survival of the friendliest. It was always cooperation. And I think we've gotten so far away from that. And nowhere is that more evidence than in the workism and the capitalist mystique we push on our kids. Oh, wait until you have your good job. You've got a master's degree, but you'll earn even more with a PhD. You're at a community college now, but, if you can get into a better school and finish, don't let relationships get in the way of that. And I just feel that in my life, I've been so lucky that one thing that Genie and I kind of did right, if I can hold one thing out that wasn't just luck, is that we always had a very countercultural view of ourselves. Self-employed, I'm an artist and writer, a painter, get by as you can. She started a small publishing company to help pay some bills. We were never part of the system. No tenure track for us, no paycheck, freelance life as an artist and creative person. And our motto was always, well, we'll just keep going until somebody stops us. And Jeannie always described us as babes in the wood. And we feel like we got away with something because we didn't. I left the safety of the evangelical world where I was being groomed to be an evangelical leader. And that was the last time we knew where any paychecks were coming from. So if I could just give one word and then go to the next bit of questions, and that is what I would urge people to do is really rebel against the ethos of the moment that puts work and career ahead of everything. We don't ask people, who are you? We say, what do you do? And by that, we mean identify yourself. How much money do you make? Are you on tenure track? Are you smart? Are you educated? But the way we measure that is not how good are they at relationships? How much time did this kid who was dating a friend of mine's daughter waste when he spent 7 years with her, then wouldn't commit and broke up, then said he was lonely, wanted her back? She's in her 30s now. At some point, somebody should have said to him, hey, listen, life is really short. Fertility's a real deal. You're a selfish pig. What are you doing? What are your priorities in life other than caring for the people you're closest to? This is no way to treat another human being. So, are we interested in the human quality of our lives that Elizabeth Marshall Thomas found in the Kalahari with the what are sometimes called the Bushmen there? that took care of each other, where tasks were equally shared between male and female. They'd never heard of feminism, but that's they did that because you survived that way. Or do we think that do we think we're somehow independent of our capitalist society, that where everything is about job and work and income and status, and yet at the same time, to be truthful, we've been steamrollered totally into the system? So I think what I'm calling for is a bit of a countercultural revolution against that system, where you could earn a lot less, but you're living in the same neighborhood you were raised in. You're across the street from your parents. They'll help you with the kids. They have other priorities too. So your dad earns less because now he's helping you with daycare for your child. This is not impossible. It's all possible if people's priorities change. So I think that's where I'm coming from.
I want to say thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Frank.
I'm sure there's a lot of questions.
Yeah, if you're willing to stay on, I'm not seeing any questions in the Q&A, so we can just converse for a while. Frank, some of the things you were just saying remind me of a term I heard recently called meta-crisis. That what we're facing as a planet right now is a meta-crisis, and they're using the term differently than polycrisis. It's not just that there are many crises at the same time, but that what we're experiencing is a crisis of multiple value systems. And I think what I heard in your talk tonight was that it's not so much the individual behavior of this couple or that couple, or the choices they make, or the timing. And I heard some of that in what you said, Barbara. Yeah. But more, it's a problem of societal values. What is it that we think of as important and prioritize? And to do that without any judgment about the behavior that other people, how other people express their values through their behavior and their choices, but to do it in a way that works for the whole society. And I think an undertone of what I'm hearing from you has to do with that whole the relationship between self and community. And our society is so individualistic that we've almost taken the self out of the community. We don't value extended families. We don't value neighborhoods. We don't know our neighbors. We don't spend time with them. Even the block party in city neighborhoods of my childhood, I don't think happens much anymore. So am I hearing you correctly that there's that what's needed is something radically different that has something to do with cooperation and friendliness and reverting to a more village or communal way of thinking about our relationship, our orientation in the world?
Yeah, and if you look at the statistics, they're very clear, and there's no argument about them. The average American moves 8 times in their life, and this starts in college. So whatever community where you were in, we tell young people, oh, no, the thing to do now is to move to the other side of the country to get ahead. See you in 4 years. And they go and form this fake community in a college or a dorm. They make these close friends that they almost never see again afterward, or maybe they do 1 or 2, and then they move again. And then they're offered a better job somewhere else. So any girlfriend in high school, unless she's moved to where you are, where the job's good, you're not going to keep that going. As for your grandmother, you're never going to see her unless maybe you come back for the holidays. The idea of staying put is totally lost. And we begin it by fetishizing the so-called college experience, which is never local. It's always you go somewhere else. So we have designed a system of education that the first thing it does is smash community. Because after 4 years, if it's just 4 years, and then of course go get your master's and then somewhere else for a PhD, you may be 10 years into adulthood before you ever even have a place that you feel settled in again, by which time now your parents are older, or they've moved because they've, quote, retired, and so they've moved because they're sick of shoveling snow, whatever it may be. When you put it all together, the average American moves 7 to 9 times, according to the last piece I read on it. And basically, if you ask why, it's always career. Very rarely does someone say, to hell with this, I'm moving back to where I feel most comfortable, where I grew up, where I knew people. Well, of course not, because you didn't grow up there either, because your parents were moving too. So that basically I have a lot of military friends because my son was a Marine for 5 years. But that said, we have basically voluntarily turned ourselves into military families, base to base to base to base to base. So we're all military brats now. We don't have a place that we really know. Now, that's not evil. But if you long for stability and community, which everybody says they do, now you add the cell phone culture into that, and everybody's staring down with, earbuds in. I walk my dog every day. I always talk to everybody I see. The younger people always look straight ahead and eyes down on the phone and or earbuds in, so they can avoid eye contact and conversation. They're so out of the loop on human connection now that just the old-fashioned "how you doing?" "Hi" on the way by, if somebody's biking by, they literally can't hear you because they are in a permanent isolation chamber of electronic machinery.
Is that partly because if they interact, somebody's going to try to sell them something?
Maybe, but also they're strangers everywhere. They've just done 4 years in college and then another 2 years on a master's program. They're not from there anymore. And we have designed a culture that we don't question anything about. Nobody questions, is it a good idea to go to college? Hey, I got into an Ivy League school. Why would I go somewhere local? I got into Cornell. Of course, I'm not going to go to, Ithaca, whatever college, because I'll earn twice as much through a lifetime if I go to an Ivy League. We don't have any formula for encouraging people to live joy-filled, connected lives, because that's like that thing you do once you've got all that stuff that you get by moving and moving and moving and moving and job, 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 job. So I'd say the biggest enemy of our joy, our ability to share joy, if human connection is where human joy is felt most, which Elizabeth Marshall Thomas finds in the old way of her book in the Kalahari, if this is the original human condition out of which we all evolved, which it is, if you have any view of scientific evolution, the first thing it teaches you is that when Jesus came along and said, "Love your neighbor as yourself," that wasn't a revolutionary idea and why Christianity succeeded. That idea caught fire because we already all knew that, because evolution had taught us if you want to survive, you have to do these things. Margaret Mead said the first evidence of civilization was finding a fossilized, healed human femur, because it proved that someone cared for you, because it's a life-ending injury. And at the moment when you begin to find fossilized human, certain injuries where you can tell from the bone that it's been healed, someone took care of that person. That's the beginning of civilization, if you want to use that word in a non-pejorative sense. Well, that's what Elizabeth Marshall Thomas writes about. And her book was such an enlightenment to me, because it was like, oh, this is the way we're supposed to be. That rings a bell. So, sorry, but Jesus didn't come up with anything original. And a religion was formed simply because of the common sense of the teaching that already was in the bones of everyone who had survived in any culture. Love your neighbor, care for them as yourself. These are not revolutionary teachings. So I have a very different view. I think evolution is the great teacher of love, not God, not religion. And I think that the need for God, in the sense that Barbara was talking about, is evident in the fact that we respond to something universal and are horrified when it goes awry. But if you design a whole culture around non-communication and other priorities beside connection, you get what you pay for. And now we're in the loneliness epidemic where people can't even connect. So, it's not just come full circle. It's an open question of whether this can be fixed or not. And I'm not saying I'm a pessimist or an optimist, but I think that what I'm saying is actually revolutionary. And I don't mean that to be pompous as in original. It's not original at all. Any Bushman in the Kalahari can tell you what I just said in this talk. So
we're almost out of time. So Barbara, anything you want to add or say or respond?
No, I guess just going back to what my own theme in responding was, When you referred to the hard times over the years with Genie, were you aware that the beginning of it, the foundation, how you felt at the beginning, was a kind of anchor that helped, in addition to all the other things that you learned how to do in order to love over as you matured and evolved, was the beginning pull of the two of you together? Did you find that that was an important anchor to feel and go back to?
Very much so. It was a real thing. And that's why I feel so sad for young people who were told, A, you're too young, or B, this isn't the real thing. You'll understand when you're older.
Yeah.
So I would feel just as bad, by the way, and this is not theoretical, because I experience this too, to younger people looking at some older couple getting together saying, what are they doing? They're 70 years old. You know, the BBC did this program a little while ago I was listening to, where they said there's a new government survey on sexual practices between the ages of 16 and 60. And I looked at Genie and I said, 60? What's wrong with these people? You know, what are they talking about? Talk about ageism. You know, the curve of sexual experience within a long-term relationship has nothing to do with age, and has everything to do with exactly what you're talking about. And that is the continuity of the passion and the experience that's rooted back into those first meetings. So it's not a question of age, but it's a question of understanding that, you know, there is no such thing as age appropriate when it comes to serious connection. If you have a 16-year-old who falls madly in love with his high school sweetheart, and they're going in different directions to go to different colleges, but still in love, you know, for God's sake, say, hey, listen, you know, I'm not telling you to get married, and I'm not telling you this is it for a lifetime, but, you know, the idea that this was now and later after college, you'll know more and so forth. I said, you know, you better stay in touch. And if it comes up that you've got a choice between a higher paying job and staying in touch with Emily or whoever it is, don't be a fool, because a job is just a job out there. And there's not maybe just one person for anybody. But if you have that real connection with someone, do not throw it away. And that's nothing to do with heterosexuality. I would same for someone that,
right,
you know, passionate gay marriage or love. I just think we put such an emphasis on, quote, getting ahead, that, you know, we finally get there and we have nothing with us because we've trashed everything that actually mattered along the way. And I'm not saying relationships are the only thing that matters, but we've trashed a lot of other things too. The aesthetic quality of our life, the people we know, living in one place long enough to be part of the community, the kind of settled feeling that you get with that. We are measuring all these things that actually make life worth living by a yardstick that doesn't match the actual evolutionary human condition. And when you go back and read the book that I'm talking about, Elizabeth Marshall Thomas's book, The Old Way, I really recommend it because it's shocking what primordial hunter-gatherer culture that actually survived, so that she could see, not just look at fossils, but it was actually there. Nobody had been there or met these people before. It's shocking because they are actually living the lives we all say we want. And we're so far from how to get that. We don't, you know, we wouldn't even know how to start. So when you talk about evolution, maybe moral evolution is to go back to some basics here that have been forgotten.
And I know you're not saying go back to the 1950s where people feel stuck in bad marriages and bad communities.
Nothing about that, or that divorce is bad, or that you've got to stick with, nothing to do with that. This is nothing to do with that. I'm talking about how you shape personal choices and the direction of social activism to actually respond to what gives people the most joy in life. And it's not the highest paying job.
Let's leave it there. We're out of time. Thank you. Yeah. The most important things in life.
Thank you.
Thank you so
Barbara.
much.
Thank you very much, JD.
Thank-
Talk to you.